All right, Ariel, this is the inaugural show of the Fireside PM video podcast on YouTube. How are you doing, sir?
Good, Tom. How are you doing?
It's a little meta because obviously both of us worked at YouTube on creator things, and here we are creating content outside of the company.
Outside of YouTube, also.
Yes, it is being syndicated onto YouTube, but we are using a third-party tool to facilitate this live stream, which is designed to be compatible with YouTube, and I
Open
think
platforms.
it's open. Everybody can use whatever works best for them. So why don't we start with a little bit of an introduction? Like, who's Ariel Bardeen, and where are you calling from?
Well, that's like a very broad question, but I think you
It
mean in the
is.
context of product. So, yes, I was a product VP at Google for 16 years, and before that, I was a developer, mostly Java front end stuff. At Google, I worked in ads for 8 years, mostly advertiser-facing products. Yeah, we worked together there too, so that was
Mm-hmm.
a double shift that we got. And after that, I went to lead payments, the whole tap and pay and sending money to people, and a bunch of internal projects as well for billing. And then YouTube for about so that was 3 years, and then YouTube for about 5 years, working on creator products, working closely with creators and all the different products we can create for them.
So I remember when you and I first intersected was when I first joined Google as a PM, and I remember being in a conference room with you in Mountain View, and we were like both commenting on the accessibility of information and how everything was pretty open and transparent. And I was just curious. I guess you were at Google for so long. Do you think there's like a Google approach to product management, or like how do you see like the job of a product manager?
Yeah, what's interesting is I've only been a product manager at Google.
Yeah.
Implicit in my little history there was that I've only PM'd at Google. So I was a developer, went to Stanford, did this master's program within the School of Engineering called MSNE, which is a little bit businessy, and that helped me kind of transition from zeros and ones to grayscale, shall we
Mm-hmm.
say, which I think is needed for product management. And then I've only been a PM at Google, so I've learned the Google way of PMing, which, by the way, is different in different teams, et cetera. So um, let's see. Some of the things off the top of my head that I enjoyed about being a PM at Google. One, there was, I would say, intellectual honesty and uh, being kind of very open and transparent with data and how your product is doing. I've launched plenty or had launched plenty of products that did not do well, and so we killed them, and that's okay. So that part, I think, the transparency and kind of the innovation approach, which is like, hey, let's try stuff, and it's okay if they fail. Ideally, we execute well, not just like we executed poorly so fail, but like, hey, it didn't work in the marketplace. That's okay. Those are a few things that I enjoyed.
Now that you're outside of Google and sort of thinking about your next chapter, do you think about like what we did as product managers in terms of our craft differently? Like now that you're outside of the Mountain View bubble?
The thing that jumps to my mind mostly is, so I've been advising a bunch of different startups, different phases, trying to help out where I can. And some of the tools that I kind of assumed were useful are not always employed in different places. So, as
Hmm.
an example, OKRs at Google are a pretty standard thing. I suspect all teams use them, but maybe there are a few teams that don't. But as an aside, when I first heard about OKRs, I thought, this is kind of silly, just a documentation exercise. But over time, I realized that they are actually very interesting and really a way to bring strategy to life. But not all companies do OKRs or have like a clear cadence of decision making, et cetera. And so it's been interesting to see how different companies roll and how they make decisions and make sure the resources are applied to the decisions and all that kind of stuff, which traditionally at Google is OKR framework.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you I mean, I've definitely worked with people who are so OKR focused that if it's not on one of their OKRs, like they won't talk to you, and they're that like religious about them.
Yeah, and you know that I
Uh,
don't subscribe to that, right? You always do the right thing, and things should be flexible, but it's also helpful to know here are the 10 big things that we're focused on, and let's make sure
right.
that they're staffed, and let's make sure that we have, product reviews, and we know what we're building, and teams have goals, and we agreed on the metrics and all that kind of stuff. Um, so then,
Yeah. So
I guess most things in product I find are shades of gray.
yeah.
So I wasn't fully joking about the like being when I was an engineer, it was more about zeros and ones kind of thing, more absolute kind of the code works, the code doesn't work, added a button to a screen or didn't. But when you're in a product management role, it's much more shades of gray.
Yeah. I mean, even with like, I bet for some people outside of Google or who haven't worked there, they might have this impression that we're kind of uniformly hardcore OKRs, and there's certainly a baseline of it. But even within teams, like there's different emphasis and,
Yeah, different ways of doing them.
yeah.
As you know, I like to do them in spreadsheets and have them be operational and have reviews and update status and all that kind of stuff. And there are teams who are not as kind of OKR as a living document, but more OKR at the beginning of the quarter and kind of you check in at the end of the quarter. But teams kind of know what they're doing, and I know some teams might feel it, and I've seen that also with some folks that I've talked to that OKRs are restricting. Right, that it's better to just not really have OKRs, maybe have some general themes and let teams run independent and figure things out over time, which is a different approach. I think as you scale, that's another dimension, that as you scale, the requirements kind of changes. You have more people that you're trying to guide and make sure you're running in the right direction. You need a little bit of process, and I think you know that I don't like process for the sake of process, but a little bit of process, if it accelerates execution, is probably a good thing.
Yeah, I guess that probably is becoming really clear as you work with some of these startups as an advisor, that you may not take the full Google playbook and apply it to them, because if they have 20 people, like it's just
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and frankly, the approach I've been taking is just you start from a blank page and kind of you see what's needed and where can you help with the tools you know about. And if it's helpful and if people want it, then you help, and if not, that's fine. By the way, as an aside, one of the things I was reflecting on, I don't think there's intuitively, I have no data to back this up, but let's not let that get in the way of a conclusion. My intuition is that good execution and kind of, let's say, OKR driven or like processes that are like good are not necessarily correlated with success. I think you can still be a company that's wildly successful and you just don't execute very well. So I don't view it as like it's a requirement. I just think that it lowers risk, and on the one hand lowers risk so that you execute better, and that way if there's a certain amount of luck and all that kind of stuff that are needed for success, everything else happens, you're more likely to succeed. The second thing on a personal level is it's in my control. I can choose to execute well, or I can choose to execute kind of willy-nilly. Why wouldn't I want to be like top of my game PM? Right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I've come to think about it.
Yeah. It's sort of like the farmer can't control the weather, but they can control how well they set up their irrigation system. And, ultimately, if you have like some kind of heat wave, your crops are going to die no matter what, but at least what you can control, like you might as well give yourself a little bit of a better chance.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, because then
Yeah.
also as a farmer, if you know how to farm, maybe you got the wrong crops, in our case products or teams or whatever, and now you've got a different crop. Because you know how to be a farmer, that crop will be wildly successful. Or maybe
Yeah.
you have to
Yeah.
change the land that you're on because you're on like sand and you move to a new location, and that's actually great land, but because you know how to execute. So another way of saying it is, even in failure, you can still execute well.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Now with OKRs in particular, some people will probably hear that and they're like, okay, objectives, key results, like, sure, I'll come up with it and I'll do it the Google way. Like, what do you think is some of the nuance of doing OKRs well?
Yeah, and as I mentioned to you, I'm thinking of actually making some videos, not live, recorded, on these kind of topics. I'll probably have a better approach if people are interested in that. I can post on LinkedIn or whatever. Let's see. So one litmus test of OKRs is if they don't cause conflict within the organization, and you don't have like serious discussions, you're not doing it right. Right?
Mm.
So like as an example, if the marketing team does not have any stress about the full set of OKRs because they don't have enough resources to do everything you want, or the legal team does not, or the engineering team does not, you're probably not pushing enough, and you're not pushing the boundary, and maybe it's just a documentation exercise. I find that OKRs are like complemented by a strategy. And so a strategy, however you want to capture it, deck, doc, whatever, there's something that lays out the company's strategy. And then the OKRs are really making the strategy live and bubble throughout the organization. As I mentioned, I like to have a spreadsheet, just keep it simple. By the way, having OKRs, in my opinion, is better than not having OKRs, regardless of how you do it and regardless of how deep you are, et cetera. Because it's also, for organizations, I think it's a learning process over the period of time, whatever that is, weeks, months, quarters, whatever the cycle of development is. The first time you do OKRs, maybe they kind of like aren't great, and you keep building them, and they get better and better over time. Tactically, I like to have also themes. I think you recall maybe like, I don't know, 3 to 5 themes for our team within YouTube kind of thing. And then they don't change over the years, ideally. Maybe once in a long time, one of them changes. But like the themes probably don't change that often, so they're very generic. And then you have objectives that change, say, quarterly or whatever your development cycle is. And then you have, I like to separate the KRs, the actual metrics you're looking at, from the projects. Because sometimes they get confused. Having a project launch is not the same as having success and achieving your OKR. And so having 2 columns explicitly for that will let you very quickly see, like, oh, we have OKRs here, but we don't have any projects against them. Is that the right way to approach it? And then lastly, you have just execution fields, like who owns it, very important, what the status is, notes, etc. And then you have a cadence of meeting and reviewing them, etc. And the process of coming up with those objectives for the quarter or whatever time period you're talking about, plus the KRs, plus the projects, it should not be a trivial exercise. That's like, these are where you'd have conversations and maybe arguments about the strategy of the company, right? And leaders and people on the teams should have opinions about what the right strategy is. And once you're done and you set the OKRs through a decision-making process, that's it. Everybody commits. You could disagree, but you committed, and you run fast in that direction until you realize you're wrong, and then you do it again.
What's the difference between your management of the OKR process later in your career from when you were, a very great, but earlier kind of mid-career PM? Like what were some of the nuances that you
I don't know
you
about the
noticed?
great part, but when I started out, coming from an
Yeah.
engineering background as well, I didn't really have appreciation for kind of the planning phase, the upstream stuff. So I'd like to build things. So I treated it a little bit more as a documentation exercise. Let's just document what we're doing. Not a lot of thought about like, okay, which KRs do we want? Why these numbers versus those numbers? What comps do we have? Or how did we come up with these numbers? Are we pushing enough, etc. And then also I didn't have as much emphasis on strategy that leads to the OKRs. So as I become maybe more senior, it's important to me, before you do the OKRs, have a document that lays out your strategy. Like, what are you trying to achieve, and how, and what have you chosen not to do? What are the big bets you're making, etc. And then do the OKRs, which are, again, like on a quarterly or monthly basis or whatever you do them, will just capture the strategy and the progress against it.
You talked about a column for the KRs, the key results, versus like the projects that are designed to achieve those results. I've heard some people say, hey, we don't want to prescribe the projects because the KR is what matters. And if we prescribe up front what the projects are, then you're not giving the teams enough flexibility to pursue it in a better way. How do you feel about that?
So one thing we should say is that OKRs, at the limit, when you do them in quotes right, you would have OKRs at the company level. You would have it at the kind of division or group level. You'd have it at team level. You'd have it individual level. And so it may be the case that at the company level, the leaders don't want to have the specific projects prescribed. Okay, but like, for example, when we were part of YouTube and we were the creator team, I think kind of at my level, I'd be remiss if I didn't know what projects were going on, right? for example, it's important that the leader does some kind of reviews and right, can provide feedback and can make sure that there's support and coordination across kind of the wider organization. So at some level, there need to be projects. The other thing that I mentioned also is that you could also have the litmus test of, well, we have KRs, but we don't have projects. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Some KRs might be just tracking KRs, but most KRs from a product perspective should have projects against them that you're actually trying to move those KRs. And so that it will be hard to actually know whether you have sufficient projects. Are they staffed enough? By the way, when you come to headcount planning and all this kind of stuff, how do you plan headcount? You could say just like, hey, we raised this much money, we have this much, we can hire this many engineers and just go at it. Or you could say like, well, we have this project that's delivering this part of the strategy. It's going to need 10 engineers, so let's staff it. And so another use for these OKRs is to know what you're building so that you can plan for resourcing.
So let's take our farmer example for folks that are watching this live or on replay. If you and I were working together again on like some agricultural startup or just agricultural company, and we said, hey, we should use OKRs to organize ourselves, what do you think would be some of the first steps we would take to kind of do that process?
Yeah, so strategy again. So like, let's say we can grow corn.
Okay.
Is our strategy to provide to be the best supplier for the ethanol industry?
Mm-hmm.
Is it to feed our local cities because we just feel that we want to do local and it's more of a social good kind of situation? Is corn the right thing to grow based on our environment? Maybe we care about global warming. Maybe we should be growing a different crop because now we've learned about global warming, et cetera. So those are examples of like how you would set high level strategy, right? But let's say we're sticking to the corn example. So I would assume that this is a very kind of unit economics intensive environment, right? And so you want to capture some notion of economics in your OKRs. Like an objective could be operate on a break even or operate with a certain profit margin, right? And you would probably want to have something along the lines of, get the grain cheaper this quarter than you did last quarter. Get it just in time, or maybe not. Maybe you want to get it into some place with storage, right? So the KR could be, how quickly do you get your grain, or how quickly does it make it into the ground, right? Can you get I don't know what the factors of farming are, but is a factor of success how quickly you can get your grain into, or the seeds, I guess, maybe I'm using the wrong term, the seeds into the ground. And maybe you need to buy new machines to do that. And so, OKR objective could be like find new machine, buy new machine, deploy new machine. And then those are the kind of the projects. And then the KRs would be, okay, we want to get, 1,000 seeds per minute into the ground, right? But you see where I'm going with this. And then Tom would be the owner of that in my big farm. And Tom would tell me periodically, how are we doing against buying the new machines, right? And by the way, before we do all that, Tom would come to like the leadership of the farm and say like, hey, I think we should have an objective around this, buying this new machine. Here's how I got to the decision, et cetera. And the leadership would all agree, yes, we're going to spend $1 million on this new machine. So that by then, when you're executing against getting bids and whatnot and finding the machine, you're not like, nobody's like, why are we buying this machine? Right?
Yeah. One of the things that I still remember when we worked together in the past, early on, was a lengthy discussion on how do we measure success for this organization overall? Like, what's the one number we want to get at? And it was kind of like this North Star. And in this example with the farming stuff, we went into like, we're going to start doing these work streams and stuff. How important, or where do you see like kind of the North Star goal setting as it relates to kind of OKR
that's actually a really
operations?
important point that you raised, because I've worked in environments where it was very hard to quantify the value of what you're working on from a hard KR perspective. So where that is happens a lot is when you work on products that are what I call like front end products, right? So when I was in ads, building products for advertisers, versus there was another team that was, figuring out when to place which ad, how the ads should look, etc. Right? And if you dial how the ads show up on a web page, you can move a lot of money very quickly. So the KRs are pretty quick, pretty clear, right? It's like revenue per thousand, etc. Like they're very hard metrics that you can optimize against. In our collective world, if you recall, how do you quantify the value to Google of having great products for advertisers to manage their campaigns? Now, you might argue in theory that they should be able to get better ROI, but remember that other team that you have no control over, they decide when the ads show, right? And so you don't really have control end to end. So you come up with what I would call softer metrics, like, for example, time on task, right? So like our flows, or the amount of time it takes you to set up a campaign decreases, etc. So you come up with those kind of metrics. But they're not as, shall we call them, clean as like we're delivering to Google the value because we are delivering this many dollars, etc. Like you have to have, again, shades of gray. So you have to have the openness to know that sometimes your KRs aren't going to be perfect and your North Star isn't going to be perfect. But in the case of the grain, for example, or the
corn.
Let's take that one. I think the first part of what I discussed was really what you want to spend time on as a leadership team, right? Like, what is the goal of my farm?
Yeah.
Right. Like, I know folks who have wineries and they do it late in life after they've been very successful, and it's like a passion project, right?
Yeah.
And so they sell a lot, make a lot of money. Those are all like secondary things. Like they want to just create the best wine out there, right? There may be other wineries that are, very commercial in nature. They have whatever, they're owned by private equity, who knows what. They're in need to make, the numbers work. And it's all about that. And if quality suffers, it's okay, because that's not the goal. So that's why I mean that without a clear understanding of strategy, it's very hard to write OKRs, because you might just be writing OKRs about optimizing for cost when really the owner or the leadership wants the best wine out there, doesn't care about it. Right. And this is where you can see how discussions can be very interesting, and people could have very strong opinions about the meaning of life.
Yeah. I mean, and I've definitely observed that where if there isn't strong alignment on why we're here and what's sort of like the headline problem we're trying to solve, then it starts to kind of manifest itself in the mid-level OKR setting, because you start to get a sense of like, well, why is he proposing that? Doesn't make any sense. It's because he's trying to optimize for something else. And we haven't talked about that something else. Like, is this farm for us to make money? Is it for us to employ our neighbors? Is it just to have the best, best corn possible? Why are we doing this? How do you make sure it doesn't become a never-ending meaning of life conversation? Because when you have a group of smart type A people like that could be a long process.
Yeah. So another concept that I've come to really appreciate is escalations. And that's something that I know you've heard me talk a lot about. Some people might think that escalations are a negative thing. And just to be clear on what an escalation is. So in my interpretation of an escalation is Tom and Ariel don't agree about something. There's an escalation to somebody more senior who can make a call. Now, some people view that as like, if Tom is escalating against Ariel messed up. And especially and they're like second order concerns. Like, for example, if you're in an environment like Google where there's 360 reviews and your peers have a big say in whether you get promoted and all these other downstream things, you might be biased to try to not find conflict and to just agree and let things kind of settle down. What I would tell folks on my team is, as a PM, if you don't have an escalation against you, say once a quarter at least, you're not doing your job. It's very important to have escalations. The trick, though, is to do them right. And so a right escalation, in my opinion, is one where, for example, Tom does not go behind Ariel's back to some decision maker, lobby without Ariel in the room, get a decision, come back and say, aha, a decision has been made, right? So it needs to be an open and transparent process. Ideally, Ariel and Tom get together, work on a slide together that articulates, here are the two options, pros and cons. By the way, what I've seen is, if done right, even at that phase, 90% of the disagreements get resolved, because just me trying to articulate to you what your opinion is or your option is and the pros and cons, and you doing the same for mine and what are the pros and cons, and trying to collect some data. It's like, oh, why did you think this? Oh, I didn't understand that you were thinking this, et cetera, et cetera. Usually the issue is resolved, because at least we were very fortunate, I think, at Google. We had very reasonable people who wanted to do the right thing. And so most people that you would have a disagreement with could be swayed with data and logic, et cetera. And not all organizations are like that, of course. But that, that's one aspect of escalations. Another one is what I mentioned before, which is just disagree and commit. So you don't want to be spending all your time, arguing about stuff. At some point, you have to start marching forward. And so find that decision maker that everybody agrees is a decision maker, bundle up the options, come to a forum that has enough people in there so the decision will stick, get the decision. And then, Tom, if you won the day, then I will, execute your idea as well as I would have executed my idea. Never do this passive aggressive stuff of trying to, torpedo your idea to get my idea going or anything like that. And that's like a really critical part of how you avoid just endless running around in circle. And it's interesting how sometimes people don't do that. The way I think about it, and I'm sure you've heard me say this a lot, is like we'll be in a meeting, a lot of arguments, and at some point it's like, listen, you don't agree with me, I don't agree with you, let's go to our collective boss or somebody, right? And just make it explicit. And that just stops the endless running around.
Yeah, I think it makes perfect sense. And I hear that like other cultures like Amazon, they do that very, like they celebrate escalations and they do it even more frequently. How do you deal with, here's a question, actually our first Fireside PM live stream chat question. How do you do it without creating drama, right? Because the person you're escalating with, it's possible that they feel like, wait a minute, now you're going to make me look bad. And this is like a me versus you thing in front of our collective bosses or a collective boss. How do you set up a escalation in a way that's constructive and effective?
Well, the first thing is that the leaders, as high as you can go, need to set the context that this is a good thing. We like escalations. We have escalations, right? And set here's how you do them, the playbook, right? Mm-hmm. Along the line of what I discussed, or some other mechanism, whatever works for the organization. And then the next part is, it's not Ariel escalating against Tom. Try to make it less personal. There are two ideas that we can do for the next phase in our project. Mm-hmm. Here's option one. It's well thought out because both of us spent time on it. And here's option two. Same. We both spent time on it and we're presenting it together. And frankly, I wouldn't even say in the meeting whose idea is, which option belongs to Tom and which is Ariel. These are just two ways that we can go forward. We've thought it out. We've socialized it with a bunch of people. And, we just need a decision to move forward. And just like the whole tone needs to be completely objective and it's all cool. By the way, like it can never be something where it's like, I really want to take part of Tom's team so I can grow my empire or anything like that, right? And I think that after you do that, say you and I do that for the first time, we hopefully come away thinking like, that other dude's pretty cool. I'd want to work with him again, right? And that should be the goal, because sometimes we get kind of wrapped around the axle on like my idea as opposed to an idea, right? It's really what matters is finding all the good ideas and building the one that seems most likely to succeed and moving forward. And by the way, if it turns out that it didn't work and you need to build the other idea, okay, you do it. That's fine. It's not like, Tom, you were wrong.
Yeah.
Now, all that said, it is better to be right than being wrong. When you look at 100 cases, you would want to be 51 and above on the right side. If you're constantly, fighting for things that are just like not good, that is not great. But in my experience, that's not happening with reasonable people. It's usually reasonable ideas where it's just like there's an uncertainty involved and you just don't know for sure what's just the right way to go. By the way, another thing that related to escalation is the more you know about your market, the more you know about your customers, the more you know about your data, the more buttoned up your opinion will be, and the better the presentation to the decision maker will be in general. So it's just like core PM skills should be applied to it. But I think the key thing is saying, okay, we have it's almost like how they have this concept when you're a pilot, right? You have to declare an emergency. The emergency might be going on. You've lost an engine, right? But there is this notion of you declare an emergency and now all these processes kick in. And I think sometimes people don't realize that they need to declare an escalation. And now let's take out the playbook for how to handle an escalation and move forward, as opposed to just like, okay, we're butting heads, and that's not helpful for anyone. So the fact that you declared an escalation with a playbook that gets applied is super helpful.
Let's talk a little bit about the other side of escalations. Do you ever feel like, I'm guessing in the past, you may have encountered things that were escalated to you that didn't need to be escalated to you? Do you ever feel like the other side happens where it's kind of premature escalation, or is it always the
Maybe
other way?
if the options aren't buttoned up or aren't clear, or the teams have not, for example, socialized them. Like, let's say you go to decision making meeting, and let's say I'm the decision maker, and you have a cross functional folks, marketing, legal, et cetera, and they've never heard about this issue, and they should have a strong point of view because it impacts them, right? Or PR or engineering, or pick your cross functional folks. That's like a process failure, right? Then it's like, hey, folks, go please have a few more discussions. Come back when you're ready, right? But because I like escalations and try to encourage escalations, even when they're not buttoned up, I don't get like annoyed at them or anything like that. And it's still an opportunity to give some off the cuff feedback, or like off the cuff things like, oh, did you look at this? Did you look at that? Without giving a decision, to give some feedback to teams. I find to be helpful. And so I would almost say, like, when in doubt, escalate. Right. By the way, it doesn't have to be to the CEO of a 20,000 person company. It can also be just like to a collective person that both sides like and trust and think that they can get a good feedback from. Right.
Totally. Yeah. I think one of the nuances that you mentioned that I just wanted to underscore is, if done well, many of the pre-escalation sort of preparation results in the consensus that no longer requires the escalation.
Oh yeah, that's my
The
point.
process of putting it together. Yeah.
I would hypothesize
Yeah.
that 9 out of 10 times that's what will happen.
Yeah.
By the way, when I tell PMs on my team, like, I expect an escalation against you once a quarter, usually I don't get them. But it is liberating. And you know what? It's also important is when you grow, like Google grew. When I joined Google, there were like 2,500 people, and when I left, it was whatever, 100 and something thousand, 150. New people coming in, I think by default assume that you have to play nice with everybody, and that's a requirement. And I don't mean being rude or anything like that, right? But just like that, you have to agree, and agreeing is the currency. And so it's actually in the leader's interest, I think, to have, if you believe that better products are built by having a diverse set of opinions, which I do believe, you want to have a culture where people can disagree. It's encouraged, and you want to make sure that especially new people, know that that's the case. Because before you know it, the new people are 50% of the company, and your culture has just kind of shifted completely away from escalations. And by the way, it is very important to clarify that being respectful, being nice, etc., are completely unrelated to having escalations. That's another important point. Right? Escalations are not about like getting in a room and yelling at each other. That's like dumb, right? You can be respectful, you can be friends, you can get along, and still disagree. Like you and I have disagreed many times, right, about stuff. And here I am. You made the mistake of inviting me to your wonderful new show, right? I'd like to think that we have a really good relationship, and we've disagreed a lot, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that you had mentioned to me in the past is whether it's an escalation or an exec review, that it's common for some people to think, oh, this is like a big show, and I need to kind of show how great I am and how I have all the answers. But sometimes some of the most effective reviews or escalations are where we're all feeling like it's a working session. Now, I've done my homework. I've laid out the core facts. I've tried to frame it up and kind of have answers to the obvious questions. But I'm not here to try and prove to you how smart I am. Like, sometimes they're just hard problems that we need to get everybody's input on.
Yeah, and I think the socializing cross-functionally, and you may want, like, I know you and I have had meetings where it's like, hey, we have this escalation. I'm not escalating yet, but both of us would like to get your opinion, or how would you approach this problem? I think you know that I like informal and very well executed is much better than formal and all buttoned up. My boss Neil would make fun of me a lot about the decks whenever I had to present something, that my decks looked like shit, but the content was usually thought-provoking and interesting. So I prefer that.
Yeah. In fact, I remember one of the things that we did as an org was we had these kind of weekly, they're kind of like office hours where we could really put all the stinky fish on the table. And it was just the PMs and you, and we would say, hey, we're stuck here, or there's a strong opinion about this. And we didn't have to put together like a deck. Like, it was designed to be able to kind of surface things early And that's another kind of almost like a escalation preventer. Like you can kind of get in front of the stuff earlier, and it saves everybody a ton of time. And I definitely, I know a lot of people appreciated your input there.
And I think you're being
Yeah.
a little humble because that was your idea to start those.
Well, yeah, we did it together, and it was great. And I definitely, I think people appreciated it. One thing
I
that
think actually on that point, sorry to
Mhm.
interrupt, but on that point, it's like you could also have meetings with decision makers where it's not about making the decision, but about getting feedback. So I would just make that
Yeah,
clear.
yeah,
That hey, this is about, like in the early days at Google, also somebody had made that clear with one of our most senior leaders, not to name names, but that they appreciate it sometimes when you come into the room, you say, hey, this is more of an informational. We want to hear
yeah,
your thoughts. You're not like, because it's also, as a leader, you might be surprised, but sometimes it's stressful. You have a team coming, they spend all this time working on something. There's like 30 people in the room, very senior people. They have a very complex thing that you're hearing about for the first time, and they want a decision in 30 minutes, right? Which will be very material for like how the team works or the company works, et cetera. So sometimes that socializing, even with the decision makers, is good because it just gives them visibility. They might give you some ideas to think about that, again, buckets you suddenly in that 9 out of 10 where you just resolve it yourself and you don't need a decision from them. So just being explicit, and this is my point about the meta point about having an escalation process is better than not having one, because you're defining that escalations are important and this is how you as an organization want to do them.
yeah. I totally agree. I think one thing that I've noticed is there is a tendency, if someone, and we all have a little bit of that imposter syndrome, but if it's very tempting to say, oh, I should only engage with senior leadership when I have it all figured out. And then they're just I'm gonna go to this review and they're gonna give me a standing ovation. And you know, oftentimes, like, you probably could have gotten feedback earlier that would have saved you a lot of time. And you could have gotten that feedback in a very informal, low risk way. And then when it does come time for that big review, like, it's already pre-wired versus like, hey, I came out from my cave and have this like brilliant idea.
Yeah,
But
so
that is, yeah,
socializing cross-functionally is very important, and with the spirit of like, I want to get ideas, not just like I'm telling you my solution and then
right.
push it through.
Yeah.
Actually, that's one thing I would tell PMs, especially when you're more junior, and you join an organization. Maybe it's your first PM gig, and I was guilty of this myself. And you think like, okay, your job in these reviews is to get your opinion adopted, or else you failed. As
Mm-hmm.
opposed to what I've evolved to with age, and hopefully it's the right approach. The goal of the review is to get the best product out of that review. Whether that's my idea, whether it's somebody else's idea, don't care, right? Really, success of the product for on behalf of users or advertisers, whoever, is the goal of the review. And that's a mind change that I think is actually, in a way, liberating. It doesn't mean you don't
Mm-hmm.
have to do any work. It doesn't mean you can't have a point of view, right? Like I'll come into a review with a point of view, but like, again, my boss Neil was a pretty smart guy, and he would raise some issues, and like I hadn't thought through. I'd be like, oh, shit, I didn't think through that. You're right. Yeah, actually, that does change things. And okay, we'll go with Tom's idea. Done. You know, I don't take it as like I failed in the review,
Yeah.
right? What matters is the idea is better. And by the way, the other thing I would do with my boss is like I would just make it clear when we go into a review, hey, is this like more of a we want your feedback, or where we really need a decision, right? So like just bring in that timing aspect to the forum, right? Like our engineers just ready to code, and if we don't make a decision here, then we don't have another slot for like a month, and we're going to delay these things, and we need to be on stage announcing, or there's some other requirement. Like bringing that timing aspect into the decision is another thing is I find helpful.
We're going to get really into total inside baseball for PMs, but if there's ever been a channel, this will be one of them that does that. So let's say you're in an exec review. What's your position or your view on the kind of back channel instant messenger conversations during the review?
Oh, it's
Either what
firing on all cylinders. Like every review, at least the reviews I've been in, and again, environments at
Yeah.
Google, maybe it doesn't apply elsewhere, but it's like, uh,
There's almost like two conversations going
well,
on.
it's like, well, there's three. So actually, let me tell you another concept that may
Yeah.
be boring to you, but like when you communicate with people, there's two channels, and I don't think people always internalize that, right? That you and I are communicating information via words, but also you see how I'm sitting, you see the, like
Mm-hmm.
my facial expressions, all these kind of things. And so like that meta channel, I think sometimes is underappreciated, right? Like as example, like you're presenting to somebody and you're not paying attention that they are bored out of their mind, and they keep giving you hints of like, hey, can you move faster, right? And the person will just keep presenting like blah blah, like, I know my slides, I'm going to present it. Like that's an example where you didn't internalize that second channel, which is almost as important. So those are two channels, and then there's the like chat going on as well. As you become more senior, one of my failings was I didn't realize that my voice became louder and louder, right? And so the more senior you are, the more people listen hard to what you're saying and might even amplify what you're saying. And so you have to be a little bit more careful with what you say. You can't just off the cuff say, I think that idea is kind of sucky, but just like before you know it, 30 people are like, oh my God, running around. The leader has anointed this project to be bad, right? And you didn't really mean it that way. And so what I find is that there's more blunt conversations on the one-to-one chats than what you would say in the room, in the whole forum. And so like me as your manager, I would be like teasing out these kind of conversations either in real time or after, to make sure that we have a combination of what's been said in the room and what people think in addition to what they said in the room, and put that all together to get a decision made that sticks. Sometimes over chat they'll be like, hey, what does the team mean? I don't understand what your team's saying here, like stuff like that, right? And so quickly explaining, okay, what Tom meant when you said this is like in the context of this other thing. And by the way, okay, another concept is, as you become more senior, you're expected to be able to communicate more crisply on more complicated topics, which is another thing I didn't appreciate when I started in PM and as I became more senior. It's like taking a very complex topic, boiling it down to a few key things that a decision maker can quickly understand and make a good decision that'll stick on it and that they will be happy with, is a skill that gets developed over time. And so, for example, somebody, my boss or a senior engineering leader or whoever might ping me over text while you're presenting and say, hey, what does this mean? And you need to, in like 2-3 lines, explain to them a very complex something that you have like 4 slides on, and hopefully they end. Oh, I get it. Okay, and now the context of your slides makes sense, right? And so like I'd be in a supporting role to try to help you, and hopefully I do that reasonably well. But who knows?
Definitely. So let's shift gears a little bit, Ariel. I know we only have about 20 minutes left. I want to talk about career development a little bit. So you started out as an individual contributor, and I think I was one of your early direct reports, but then you ended up making your way up to the VP ranks, so there's a lot of levels in between there. Like, what was your secret? Like, how did it happen? Like, what were the things that made that possible for you?
Yeah, so a few disclaimers. Of course, this is a data point of 1. So as we know, we'll take it with a grain of salt. And also Google was different, and Google was different back in those days than it is today. And organizations are in different parts of their growth phase, right? And the organizations are early and growing a lot, and more opportunities to grow faster, et cetera. But yeah, I was very fortunate that I got promoted very rapidly. I would say that in some of the things that really helped me when I started, I took on a project that was very grungy and very difficult, which was to move AdWords from its own username and password to use what's called today Google Accounts. And it was one of the last services, I think, that was, because it was revenue, obviously, and very difficult. And the smarter PMs who came before me knew that was a all downside, no upside kind of project, right? Because like, who wants to work on a project like that? It's like
best case scenario is it works.
Well, yeah, worst, it's like plumbing, right? You don't really think of plumbing until it leaks, right? And so until something goes wrong. So but in hindsight, it was actually a really great project, because it turns out that the leaders that we had in ads really appreciated people who took on grungy projects for the betterment of the product, et cetera. And obviously there was no personal gain here. I wasn't like, oh, I get to meet all these senior people every day, and it was nothing like that. It was really in the bowels of the machine. And so that gave me a lot of credibility with people who turned out to be very senior afterwards and spread out throughout the company. So taking on grungy projects helped me. I'd like to think that I work in objective and kind of do the right thing mode, which also, so the other thing is reputation, just to state the obvious. Your interactions with everybody you work with, including escalations, creates a reputation. And so the reputation that I developed was, I think, somebody who can actually get shit done. And that helped me as I progressed. And maybe the last thing I'd cite is I started a lot of projects, many of which failed. But there was a period of time where I was running, like, I think 5 projects, all ones that I pitched and started and got funded. And so I think that that's another thing that people noticed is like, oh, this dude actually like is interesting and can, start new things, et cetera. So those are a few of the things that kind of come to mind that have been referenced by others.
How do you reconcile the grungy move everyone to Google accounts? Or I think you also worked on like, did you work on the AdWords homepage or something like, yeah, like that kind of thing, which a lot of PMs would say like, well, I'm not going to be able to build a promo packet on that. I need to come up with a new thing. How do you reconcile that with your kind of entrepreneurial starting of new products at Google as well?
Yeah, I just looked at it differently, and I know that some PMs that I would talk to would like, hey, I have an opportunity to work on this project or this project. Where do I get more executive visibility and like all these kind of questions? For me, it just didn't matter. Like, the only thing I really asked myself is this useful for whoever the customer is, and by proxy to Google. And if so, let's do it. I'm sure I'll learn things. I'm sure it'll be fun. I'll build up skills again to the point of execution. Like, it doesn't matter if you're growing corn or something else. Like, you can learn interesting execution skills that'll be helpful later. So that's how I approached it. I should say also that I was a little bit more maybe not thoughtful. I didn't have like a 5-year plan, or I didn't, I didn't really think I'd be at Google that long. I remember I met with a shared colleague of ours early in the days. I was like, I'll be here a year maybe and move on. I can't imagine staying more than a year. So I did not have any thoughts that I would become pretty senior, or that I'd stay in the same organization for 16 years. But Google, has a lot of interesting attributes that made it a good place to be for a long time.
So when you think back on was it 16 years at 16? Google? Yeah.
Minus like 2 days or something.
Yeah. What were some of like the hardest the hardest lessons learned about how to be effective as a PM?
Well, one thing I would recommend to all our listeners, that I don't know how many there are, maybe it's just you and I and Ben.
We have 5 concurrents, which is good for our first time. The algorithm doesn't really know us that well. They wait till they see what we do. Yeah.
So I think you've heard me say this before, but taking a negotiation class, and there's one from Professor Christensen, I think, at Stanford, and he posted like an hour online, which is basically all you need is watch that video. But just to answer your question a little bit differently, the key thing that I think really helped me from my short tenure at Stanford was negotiation, and being able to work with other people and have difficult conversations and conflict, but being able to hopefully work through it and be in a position that you want to work together later. That was something that was a skill I had to develop, and probably still developing. But a very, very helpful one. And so that there were plenty of times when there was conflict, but when you approach it that way, you don't shirk from the conflict, and you don't like avoid projects that are hard. You could develop a reputation for somebody who can actually take on hard things and solve them, ambiguous things, difficult things, etc. So I know I'm not answering exactly, but like thematically, that's how I was thinking about like these hard projects.
Do you remember like any nuggets from that negotiation class that folks can hear now?
I mean, you might be able to, and maybe I'm bastardizing this, but like the way I would summarize it is that when I went to that class, I thought like, okay, this dude's going to teach me that when the car dealer is saying the car is $10,000, you're going to do subtract X percentage, and if it comes out, you're going to do this, and some kind of like really sophisticated data modeling, blah blah. It was much simpler than that. It's basically listen to the other side, and assume that you're not doing a transactional thing. So maybe a car purchasing thing is not the best example, but think of it as part of a relationship building exercise, and mostly listen to the other side. Try to understand what they're actually doing. And so I cite a situation I had early in my career with a guy who became very senior at Google. He was not senior at the time. But basically, I was proposing that to have a way to automatically generate ads using like a Mad Libs kind of thing. You say you're a dentist, you're this, you're that, all the ads, keywords, etc. Why have all dentists go through like a sign up where they have to pick everything themselves? And so we had a meeting, and this dude who I didn't know was like being very annoying and like raising all these concerns about like why it's not a good idea and all that kind of stuff. And then in the end, when I actually started listening to him, he's like, yeah, like if all dentist ads on the dentist result page are like the same, that's not going to be good for users. I'm like, you know what? He's right.
Mm.
And so like just that little bit going off in my head is like, yeah, that would be kind of a sucky product that I'm proposing, So being open to that, and then him seeing that I'm, not just, I came back to him with a solution for it, and he's like, oh yeah, that's actually a pretty good solution, and we became buddies afterwards and all that, and it was really helpful to set the relationship as a side effect, and the product was better, although it wasn't successful, like many things I worked on, but that interaction could have just been annoying and arguing with each other, and I'm going to push it through with my will. Or it's like, listen to the other side and see, like, do they have a valid point? Which most of the time you'll find people do have valid points.
Yeah, no, it's so easy. I think that's where your ego can sometimes get in the way, where you feel like, hey, this is my idea. I need to convince everyone it's the right idea. And any pushback, I need to overwhelm it, versus saying, hey, maybe this is our idea. How can we make this idea better? But that's a different mind shift. And I think, it does sometimes come into conflict with people's own career development, where, it is true that a lot of people who have been successful are known for something, like, oh, that person, you put on a bumper sticker, they launched this product, that was their thing. How do you kind of balance that? Because, it is, I love your servant leader, like, hey, do the right thing and be useful. But I also feel like other people would say, hey, you also got to look out for your own career development a little bit as well.
So that's very organizational dependent, and that's why I was saying in the preamble that everything I say might be wrong because, or like not applicable to places outside of the organizations that I worked in. I was very fortunate where I worked in organizations where the leadership appreciated the attitude that you're describing, and so it turned out that actually that attitude accelerated my growth faster than had I been optimizing for growth. Ironic, right? But I would hypothesize that it's better to work in an organization where your leadership appreciates people who are, in quotes, doing the right thing, even at the expense of potentially getting promoted the next cycle and stuff like that, than leaders who are only looking at people who are managing up, picking the right projects, have a lot of visibility with them because they pick projects that are high, like all that kind of stuff. But again, to the point of what's in your, what you can control and what not, you can pick your leaders, right? If you're in an environment that's like not appropriate, find another leader. And by the way, especially when you're more junior, it's easier to find more roles. When you're more senior, it's harder to find more roles. So that's one of the benefits of being more junior. Find somewhere where like they appreciate the skill set you bring to the table. I would not be, for me, it's not an option to say like, oh, I'm in a very political organization, so I'm going to start being political. That's just not how I roll.
How do you recommend people evaluate potential leaders? Let's say they're in the market, they're talking to a bunch of different opportunities, they all sound awesome. Like, how do you suss out the leaders?
It depends on what level, but in general, you have to spend some time together. I would recommend doing some kind of mock exercise, or if you can do a real exercise, that's even better. I've been doing that. And then there's a lot of back channel involved. And so ideally, you can talk to people who know them, who can tell you how they really are, as opposed to what you might think they are. With the nuance that just, you kind of have to be careful who you're using to vet the leaders, because any good leader probably has a few people who like him or her, and a few people who don't. And so you just have to like make sure you understand who you're talking to when you get that feedback. But I would spend some time. And then I guess the other thing is, again, if you're more junior, it's not the end of the world to switch teams. When you're more senior, it's a little bit more of a pain. So like if it turns out that it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. By the way, as an aside, the first time I heard the concept fit, when I graduated undergrad, and a recruiter told me about fit, they're trying to ascertain fit during interviews. I was like, what do you mean fit? If you pay me, there's a fit.
What do you need?
Yeah, what do you need? But over time, I've really come to believe it's not just about like getting every job you want or anything like that. It's really about ascertaining fit, and that's really what you should be looking for.
When you turn the tables and you're hiring people, how do you ascertain fit?
It's very difficult. When I was an engineer, it was much easier. Did you use this JDBC method and blah, blah, blah. Like you can quickly, or write some sample code. It's actually very hard to do on the PM side. But I do look for a few things. I look for kind of fit with from a cultural perspective. Go through some exercises, make sure that there's crisp thinking, quick thinking, being able to think about nuances. I'll try to also say something really dumb and see how they correct me, to see if they're like, A, do they correct me? Not good if not. Do they just call me an idiot politely? Not good, right? So that's another thing I like to do. There's a bunch of things along those lines, but I can't tell you that I have high confidence when I make a recommendation. It's of higher or not on the PM side. I'd say I'd have medium confidence.
It is amazing how we make these decisions on often like a 30, 45-minute interview.
Crazy. In the middle of a busy day.
Yeah. It's
very interesting. Yeah. That's why back channel is so important, right? And like within Google, when people move around, and the first thing you would do is you talk to the previous manager, et cetera, people that you trust and know the person. And that's almost more important than any interviews from outside. It's a little bit harder. But one thing I've seen now is that, again, like people will reach out to me about other people that you're thinking about hiring, and I'm sure they reach out about me to other people. And the back channel is a really important channel.
We have another question from Ben. Hardest promo level transition for you?
So I think becoming a manager was hard for me. And the story I tell is that when I was an engineer, like I mentioned, I put a button on the screen and I go home and I'm happy. When I became a PM, I was trying to convince an engineer to put a button on the screen, and I was like maybe happy at the end of the day. And then when you become a manager, you're trying to convince a PM to convince an engineer to put a button on the screen. So like you get more diffused, and just kind of like figuring out how to spread yourself so that you have wider scope and shallower was hard for me, because I'm very much into the details. And so as you've suffered through, and so like just kind of letting go and growing to be a manager was harder. And then maybe I guess to being what's called like a group PM, a director, and all that, they were kind of similar, bigger scope, etc. Maybe VP was a little bit of a change as well, because that's really growing in scope, and that's softer things like realizing that my voice is very loud, and like how do you work with teams, and how do you give feedback in a way that can be heard. And there were a bunch of things that kind of kicked in at that level, and you're responsible for a whole area. So it's much more about strategy also, and making sure that you understand the strategy. When I was in payments, we changed the strategy, and then how do you execute against that? And just the decisions became like a step function change. So maybe those are the 2 points.
Last question for you, Ariel. Somehow, as we've started this, 58 minutes have passed already on this interview. So we may have to have you back on for sure. But I guess
there's 6 people next time.
Well, right now there's actually 6 concurrents. So the algorithm,
right? So it looks like I signed up.
It's starting to learn. I have a feeling this will get shared out. So if you're watching this on live, make sure you like and share. But then if you're finding us on replay, hook us up with a like and comment below what I should ask Ariel next time. But my last question is, if you could go back in time, like let's just say 10 years, and give yourself advice about how to be a more effective PM leader, like what would you tell yourself?
I think that meta stuff that we talked about is probably what I underestimated. The whole like how to give feedback, how to because I think you've seen this, but when we go into like a product review session, I think of myself as a peer to everybody in the room, but I realized over time is that they don't think of me as a peer, right? They think of me as this longtime Googler, VP, all this stuff. And so then when I say like, oh, I'm not sure that this is the way I do it, it's like, it's like it's different than what they hear. A lot of times it's different than what I intended to say. Or one issue that you have raised to me also, like another example, is that sometimes I'll ask for data, and the team then goes off and works hard to get the data, and I didn't realize it would be a lot of work or a lot of time. And so I've been trying to be very crisp that, is this a must-have, or is this, hey, if you have the data, send it to me via email, and things like that. So just all those meta issues are areas that I probably still have to improve on.
Yeah, I guess, one way to describe it, that when you're at that VP level, it sounds like, you're like a little butterfly and you move your wings a little bit and it has these ramifications that it may not be obvious
I'll tell you where also that
throughout the
happens is
org.
people who are not in the room, and especially if there's international components, like if your project touches on whatever folks in Japan or in Zurich,
Mm-hmm.
where most of our team was, and they're not in the room, time zone issues, cultural
Mm-hmm.
issues, and before you know it, this person said this thing, and it's like it's taken out of context. The context kind of gets lost in the translation, and so
Yeah.
trying to like also go down to the source and make sure that the person actually doing the work feels comfortable just IMing me and saying like, hey, did you mean this? And luckily with quite a few people, I've got to the point where somebody would IM me and say, hey, I've heard through the grapevine that you said blah blah blah, it doesn't sound right, did you really mean blah blah blah? And I'll be like, oh shoot, no, that's not what I meant, right? So thank you
Right.
for raising it. Yeah, let me clear that up.
By the way, we have a former colleague, Swaroop, who says he loved the
Waroop, how's it going?
conversation. Yes, Swaroop, make sure you like and share, bro. Murad has a question. If you have just a couple more minutes, what advice would you give a senior PM who's just joined a new team or a new company? Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, this applies at all levels, also kind of an executive or a CPO, et cetera. The first thing you want to do is set context with your boss as to what the expectations are for the onboarding, and recognize, just like escalations, declare an onboarding. We are now in an onboarding state, and just be very crisp that you are in onboarding. What I've seen happen many times is PMs come in, they think that it's their job to quickly launch something to prove to everybody how great they are. As a side effect, it's like get rid of any opposition so that I can ship something quickly, piss off everybody. Right? And so what I tell PMs that are joining that ask me this question is your job in the first few, and the amount of time you should define with your boss, but like it could be a few weeks, it could be a year, is to get credibility. The credibility is what makes you effective. And to get credibility, that means you have to know the market, you have to know the product, you have to know the data, all these things that lead to credibility. I don't mean just like build a relationship, take people to lunch, right? But you have to build up credibility. That should be your goal. It's not about the individual projects that you're launching. So I would do those two things. I would set a plan with your boss of like, what are we going to do? Am I taking 30 days to study and, et cetera? And then here are a few deliverables you want to see from me, like an articulation of our processes or whatever. And then just be in the mindset that usually in product, things are a marathon. Excuse me. Certainly there are companies that are smaller who are running fast, but even in those cases, you're investing in a PM. You want people who know the domain, and most businesses today are pretty complex. You want to grow people, et cetera. You don't want to just have people cycle through the team all the time. That's not healthy for anybody. So it's kind of like a two-sided investment, and just make it crisp.
Great advice, Ariel. You have so much on your so much experience. You mentioned you're going to be creating content, it sounds like.
Well, I
Yeah.
hope so. I don't know. We'll see. Just as I've been advising a little bit, some topics have come up that I thought might be helpful to talk about. Like I'm thinking like 5-minute videos, like a few basics of OKRs, basic of escalations, basic of like very tactical stuff. Nothing as fancy as what you're doing.
And how will people find out more about you and hear from you more?
Yeah, but please connect to me on LinkedIn or on, I guess I can.
Are you on Twitter? Or?
Although I'm kind of on it, never posted anything, I don't think. But one of those two, and then when I actually get around to it. And if people have questions or want to see content of some kind and actually think it's a good idea, happy to accept requests.
Yeah, well, go ahead. If you're watching this, put some comments in for either topics that I can hit with Ariel when he's back on the Fireside PM channel, or that Ariel can make dedicated content around for his 5-minute PM tutorials. But I really appreciate you giving me some time, Ariel, on your weekend. I know your time is valuable, and I'm taking you away from the Big Apple. But
I know Manhattan is fun, so I'm still in honeymoon. We could probably find more time in February if you want.
I love it. I love it. So you prefer Manhattan to the El Camino Real?
I prefer it right now in my phase of life. I like walking outside and having a whole world out there.
All right, Ariel. With that, I'm going to say goodbye and keep it real.
Keep it real, Tom. Thank you for the invite.
Bye.